All right, can everyone in person and online see this? Professor Kesterson, maybe you can let me know. Oh, I see some thumbs up from the folks online. All right, so again, thanks so much for having me. I've been doing a lot of work recently in game studies. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is and how we can think about games critically. We'll talk about kind of the importance of this. Um, we live in a society that for decades now has kind of consigned video games to this realm of entertainment value alone, right? And we see a lot of news articles about violence in video games. We see a lot of news articles about video game addiction, sexual content in video games. And those tend to be the three main domains, right, in the popular discourse that we see discussion of video games. And so game studies kind of emerged out of this, out of a response that, yeah, these matters are important to discuss and to study and to learn about with regard to games. But the video game medium is a much more complex, a complex beast, as it were. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done and scholars I've worked with have done in terms of analyzing video games as cultural texts and how we can achieve sort of a gaming literacy, thinking critically about games as we play them, whether we're playing on a console, online with friends, playing mobile games, or whatever the case may be. So to tell you a little bit more about myself, I started out at a community college. I started out at Cuyahoga Community College as a PSEOP student, now College Credit Plus is the name of that program. And I earned my first degree at a community college. I am a first generation college student. And I'll be honest, I walked into college for myself, not really knowing what I was doing. When I think back to, choices I made and things I did, it's amazing that I went down the path of becoming a professor. I had the great benefit and pleasure of having a few really wonderful mentors there at Tri-C and at four-year universities that I later attended that really helped guide me in that very new terrain for me. And so that's one thing I would share just right off the bat is while you're taking courses, wherever that may be, definitely reach out to your professors, reach out to staff and faculty, and find those mentors and find those who are, willing to take you under your wing. That's made all the difference in my educational journey. Once I was done with my associate degree, I transferred to the University of Akron, where I earned a BA in secondary education in integrated language arts. I was licensed to teach grades 7 through 12. And from there, I taught for a year, ninth grade English in Baltimore, moved back to the Cleveland area, and pursued my master's in English at John Carroll University. From there, I started teaching. I taught at John Carroll, I taught at Ursuline College, I taught at Notre Dame College of Ohio, I've taught at Ashland University, and most of my time has been spent teaching at Tri-C. I've been teaching as an English professor for about 10 years now, to the year, I think. And once teaching full-time at Tri-C, I went back and earned my PhD in English at Old Dominion University. Josh mentioned some of the books that I have either had coming out or coming out soon, and we'll look at a couple of those a little bit more closely. I've published a number of different articles on various topics. I made a word cloud, my first word cloud in PowerPoint, with some of the topics that my research has gone into, kind of a variety of different topics related to culture, related to video games, American culture, the South African Nobel laureate and author J.M. Coetzee. I've published a few essays on uh, across a variety of different topics, from pop culture to queer theory to mental illness in games, literature, and many other sorts of topics. So what is game studies? It's not something I just made up. So that's the first thing to say. It's a very robust interdisciplinary field dedicated to the study of the video game medium. And when I say interdisciplinary, I truly mean interdisciplinary. You have folks working in communications, in English departments, in computer science, in psychology, in neurology, education, business, and so many other fields, trying to get a handle on how this new medium works, right? And what uses it can have beyond entertainment value alone. We have folks in psychology studying the, how games impact us psychologically, including in ways that might help us. We have, I read of a surgeon who was studying the use of the Wii to train other surgeons for more precise laparoscopic surgeries. We have folks who study how the technology actually works, and different new technologies that are always coming into play. We have folks who study how video games communicate and produce meaning. We have folks who study different gaming communities and how those communities interact with one another, including toxic group dynamics and issues of harassment. We have folks who also study the video game industry, from the origins of that industry, from the labor issues related to that industry, and various scandals, not unlike the ones that have recently plagued Blizzard Entertainment, for example. So we have all these different scholars in kind of different fields, and what's great about it is they often work together to try to understand this complex new medium. So ludology may be a new word. That's often the word used for the study of games, of gaming, and of play, from the Latin ludus, which means game, and ludere, which means play. So part of what I do is I study video games as products of culture that encode specific values, norms, and ideologies. And so my work in game studies traverses the fields of literary studies, of cultural studies, of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, of continental philosophy, queer studies, gender studies, and race studies. A lot of my work looks at the philosophical underpinnings of game content. And so it's a really exciting field to be a part of. It's a fairly small and kind of close-knit community, even with so many folks working in so many different areas. And so it's a young field, and there's still quite a bit out there that is in need of analysis, in need of study, in need of data. Given that game studies really got going as a field, let's say late 80s, but really took off in the 90s and into the 2000s. So why pay attention to games? Well, one of the reasons is that video games are increasingly the dominant medium of the 21st century, the dominant entertainment medium. And this graph to the right, shows just how large of a global market it is. In 2020, we're talking about $159 billion global market. Now that's jumped up quite a bit higher from 2019 due to the pandemic, where more folks have been playing not only video games, but board games as well. So they've really seen that market grow, probably one of the few markets to see that large of a jump. But to put that in perspective, before the pandemic, we had a global market in video games of around 140 billion dollars or so. whereas the global movie industry just broke $100 billion for the first time in 2019. So you think about how the popularity of movies and film and how long that medium has been around. And we have games just skyrocketing, not only individuals playing games, but also the rise of esports games and college esports as well. All really exciting developments in the industry. Other reasons to pay attention to video games has to do with kind of this idea, this assumption, this stereotype that we have about games, that we're escaping from the real world into the video game, right? Whereas I would argue, as many game scholars have before me, that it's not so much an escape into a fantasy world that is separate from our own. That threshold, or that permeable membrane between the in-game and out-of-game world is quite a bit more in flux than we usually think about it as. So a lot of my research involves studying and thinking about video games and how they reproduce out-of-game inequalities and harmful stereotypes. And I think this is a really important reason to study video games, to take them seriously, and to think critically about the details of them as we're playing them, as we're discussing them, as we're purchasing them. As Ian Bogost, a very prominent game studies scholar and game designer, has written, he's coined the term persuasive rhetorics with regard to video games. The idea that video games are procedurally always persuading us of something, right? Two other scholars, Judd Regill and Ken McAllister, have written in their book Gaming Matters that as we play the game plays us. And I've always liked that. I usually throw that in when giving talks on game studies, because it's really true. As we're playing games, there's always something kind of playing us in the background, even if it's just the massive amount of hidden labor that goes into the game. All of the industrial practices, the labor practices, the developers, all of which are kind of kept from the player to maintain this immersive feel when within the game. And so we're always being played by the game in a sense. And so a lot of my work, both in terms of my scholarship, but also how I use video games in my classes, involves developing a gaming literacy. Kind of, how do we read video games as texts? How do we think about video games as something more than just something we do for fun? So in terms of reading and playing games critically, this slide shows my most recent book, an edited collection called Being Dragonborn, Critical Essays on the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Hopefully, maybe there are some fans of Skyrim in the audience here. This is one of the most popular video games of the past decade. It was released in 2011. And it's a game where the player is hailed as the last Dragonborn that possesses the ability to absorb dragon souls and speak or shout the dragon language, the Thu'um, to vanquish enemies and save the province of Skyrim from the imminent threat of dragons who have returned. It's against this backdrop that the player becomes aware and kind of implicated in an intricate political landscape of this neo-medieval world. At the center of Skyrim's political plights is the ongoing civil war between the Imperial Legion, with its allegiance, whose allegiance lies with the Empire, and the rebellious Stormcloaks on the other hand, led by Ulfric Stormcloak. While the player isn't forced to choose a side in this civil war, the player, of course, can choose, and both sides of this civil war are pretty ugly and terrible. And so within this game, my co-editor Mark Willett and I put out a call for papers and collected about a dozen essays that are now in this volume that went through a peer review process, vetted by other scholars in the field. And I'll talk a little bit about more about that process of writing and editing and revising and publishing a little bit later in today's talk. So these essays cover issues related to culture, history, neo-medievalism, that is how medieval tropes and images get kind of repurposed and often distorted to support ideologies and worldviews that are contemporary, that are with us now, kind of all under the guise of a medievalism that never really existed that way. So we call that neo-medievalism. The book covers issues like narrative, particular game narratives, ethics in games, modding communities, and other gaming communities that play, gender, race, politics, and so many other topics are covered in this. As an open world, fantasy role-playing game, those of you who've played it know what a massive world it is. There's so much happening. For the purposes today, though, I'm particularly interested in the Stormcloaks. So one faction in this civil war, led by Ulfric Stormcloak, whom each player begins the game with, riding next to him in a cart bound for a public execution, an event disrupted by a dragon. The Stormcloaks regularly invoke white supremacist language and rhetorics. So the Stormcloaks are a group of white, in-game Nordic settlers of Skyrim who believe Skyrim to be their land. You'll hear Ulfric and others around them referred to Nords and Stormcloaks as, quote, the true sons and daughters of Skyrim. It reminds me of the haunting line from the January 6th insurrection, "Whose capital? Our capital," they shouted. The game is full of ethno-nationalists, actually. Two of the authors, co-authors actually, in the Being Dragonborn collection, Josh Call and Thomas Lecaque, have a chapter in the Skyrim book about ethno-nationalist narratives in the game as an example of one way to read this game against contemporary culture or alongside of contemporary culture. They write, and I'll just read you a brief bit from their chapter. When Ulfric Stormcloak, and especially Galmar Stonefist, discuss Skyrim and their neighbors, they discuss them in ethno-nationalist terms. The Empire, flawed though it may be, is the only group to explicitly seek to become a multicultural empire, and even in that, they are ruled by the imperialists. Even within Skyrim, the competing groups behave in that way. The Forsworn are essentially Reachman ethno-nationalists seeking to achieve their own realm. The Orcs in Skyrim have already achieved ethno-state status, living in an orc-only community in remote Nord-free regions. The Thalmor Dominion seeks an elven ethno-state and the destruction of all political opponents. And again, the Stormcloaks envision a Skyrim that is Nord's land, with the implied and occasionally outspoken "and no one else's," end quote. So in this game, which is not a stranger to racist epithets used against other minority groups as one roams around, like against the cat race that I often play, the Khajiit, racist ethno-nationalism is embedded in so many of these discussions. The specter of colonialist habits of mind that pit the quote-unquote civilized against the quote-unquote savage are everywhere, and not necessarily challenged, except oddly enough by the Empire, with which a player is hardly ever encouraged to sympathize. There are so many other examples in this massive game. Dr. Sarah Stang has a wonderful chapter in the book all about hag ravens, which is a commune of very intelligent, kind of older women creatures that live outside the cities and towns, kind of in their own space. And she analyzes how this group of non-playing characters enact a very long history of tropes and images and language that associate femininity with monstrosity. And so she analyzes from a feminist perspective and methodology, the problems with how women and femininity is coded within this game, and how it's made to be sort of this monstrous threat to patriarchal privilege as it exists in the game. A really important chapter in the collection, and you see it even in the very name of hag ravens, right? Reproducing this misogynistic trope. My own chapter, co-written with Mark Willett, looks into those patriarchal dynamics that occur within the families of Skyrim. And so within the actual families that you interact with in the game, within the cities, but also families and family groups outside the cities. We also looked at and studied the different guilds, like the Thieves Guild and others, and how the family dynamics work and reproduce a sort of Christian cosmology in very subtle ways, in ways that aren't named as such. And so these are just kind of a few of the ways that one can think critically about these games and kind of study these games as embodying various contemporary ideologies and many current debates that are happening in the public discourse are being staged in a way, right? Because as we all know, any product of culture, whether it's a video game, whether it's a film, whether it's a novel, whether it's a comic, whatever it may be, is a product of those times. And so it's always communicating what's happening now. When we're escaping into this fantasy world of Skyrim, in many ways, we're just venturing further into what we see in everyday life outside the game. My forthcoming book, which is a fairly heavily revised version of my dissertation, is video game chronotopes and social justice, playing on the threshold. And I'm and I forgive me. I'm really excited about this being able to share this cover art with you, which I just released or just received rather. So this is the actual cover. The book won't be coming out for a few more months. There's still quite a bit of work still to be done throughout the process, but they are working on the book cover, and so we have, at my request, Bernini's "The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa" on the cover. And so this book follows 6 different chronotopes listed to the left there. And these chronotopes, which literally means time space, chronos and topos, look at kind of how time space itself communicates culture. So how can we take a particular chronotope and use it as an interpretive lens through which to understand the cultural and ideological significance of video games? And so using various slow readings of games, drawing on post-structuralist theory and gender studies, queer studies, and critical theory, I expose the often overlooked misogyny, heteronormativity, racism, and patriarchal structures present in many AAA video games through their arrangement of time-space itself. And so I borrow this idea from the idea of the chronotope from a literary theorist named Mikhail Bakhtin. And so in this project, I'm kind of updating Bakhtin's theory as it applies to new media. And so for Bakhtin, the chronotope expressed in his words the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature. So Bakhtin kind of traced various chronotopes through hundreds of years of literature to tie specific chronotopes to specific genres, understanding that all of the narratives and themes and philosophies that occur in literature and that we study in literature pass through the chronotope, pass through a particular time-space moment, right? And it's the idea that he ends his book with, the chronotope of the threshold. That's kind of my starting point to thinking about various threshold chronotopes and threshold ideas that occur in games. And so the ones that uh, I delve into in this book are the chronotope of the bonfire, of the archipelago, of the abject, of the fart as pharmacon. That's a fun one. Of madness and of coupled love. And so just as an example, in the chapter on abjection, keeping in mind that the abject is that we find revolting. You know, think blood and guts and gore, corpses, and so on. This abject that we find revolting, that reminds us of our own mortality, right? Psychoanalytically, is often purged through reveling in it. This is why we enjoy these sorts of video games. We enjoy horror movies, right? There's a complex psychoanalytic or psychosocial, let us say, response within us to these things that scholars like Julia Kristeva have written about. Barbara Creed has published a lot on this with regard to film, and Sarah Stang has been writing and publishing a lot about this in terms of video games themselves. So I look at abjection, but also how abjection is staged and experienced spatiotemporally in a dungeon crawler game like The Binding of Isaac, which is a pretty popular, if not disturbing, indie game. So within this game, The Binding of Isaac, it appropriates the Judeo-Christian binding narrative, and I argue communicates a threshold experience for the player of abjection through deploying time-space as a permanent state of emergency, an experience that unfolds the player's own precarious bare life existence, living under a sovereign power. And so these readings kind of delve into, the details. I look at the chronotope is able to look at game mechanics. It's able to look at game narratives, the images in games, the sound in games, right? Even the industrial and advertising practices surrounding the game, all of which players encounter in particular chronotopic moments, in particular times and spaces. In the second to last chapter, I analyze representations of mental illness in games like Skyrim and the Borderlands franchise, particularly how mental illness stereotypes are deployed and how such illness is often atomized as only ever an individual matter, divorced from its larger socio-political roots. This chapter pays attention to how the voices of mental illness are often pushed to the margins of games into artifacts like books, audio tapes, and other small in-game objects. The last chapter looks at the dominance of coupled love. So studying how love in its narratives, images, and mechanics is fashioned in game worlds, in popular games. So it looks at the dominance of love, of monogamy, of heteronormative marriage in video games, analyzing how the norms of coupledom and the social histories of oppression and suffering bound up within this institution, drawing on scholars like Angela Wiley and others, communicating a dominant worldview of what love looks like, often to the exclusion of non-monogamies, asexuality, and other difficulties related to this institution. So in all these examples, we see out-of-game institutions, ideologies, and dominant narratives being woven into the player's experience of games that would otherwise appear just to be fantasy or otherworldly. Again, as we play the game plays us. So that's just, I mean, a very brief sketch of that last book is, I think 110,000 words, so it's a bit lengthy. Um, but really excited to keep working on it, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Cuyahoga Community College, and especially the Jack Joseph and Morden Mandel Mandel Humanities program out there for funding some of my work on that project. So a little bit about the writing and publishing process. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I mention is that the writing process that you learn about in composition courses, that's the real deal, okay? That writing process that's often a struggle is the same writing process I go through. It's the same that all authors go through. And just the importance of peer review and feedback. If you're at Lorain County Community College, you have a beautiful writing center there. It's such a gorgeous space with such excellent writing center consultants there. Make use of that, not only for English courses, but for all of your courses. That peer review component and having others look at your writing isn't a sign of any sort of defect in your writing. It's a sign that that writing is worth revising, and that writing is only going to be made better by this normal, typical process that we go through whenever we write. From Nobel laureates to poets to anyone, we all get feedback on our writing. So I'd encourage you to find others who share your interests if you're interested in writing, and send out your work, knowing that there will be some rejection, right? And that's just part of the process as well. So real quick, I want to share just a little bit for those of you who may be interested in publishing nonfiction, kind of what that process looks like. So it often begins with a book proposal, or it may be even a conversation with a publisher, followed by a book proposal. So the proposal has a number of different sections. It has a description of the book. It includes chapter summaries, maybe a sample chapter or two, a section on the market for the book. So what else has been written about it? You know, what books would be competing with your book? And then various affiliations or connections that you have to particular professional organizations or scholars who may be interested in your proposed book. If the publisher likes the idea and their editorial board does as well, you know, they'll issue you a contract, and then the fun begins, right? Writing, revising, taking those chapters and presenting them, whether that's taking them to a writing center, taking them to a colleague, and say, hey, would you mind, you know, looking over this? I know Professor Kesterson has been kind enough to look over writing of mine in the past, for which I'm most grateful for. And then editing that work and really getting it to where it needs to be, where you can hand this to a publisher and say, this is my best version. It then goes through another peer review process for scholarly peer reviewed books, at least, where your manuscript's sent out to other experts in that particular field, and you get feedback from them, right? Sometimes this can be really positive feedback. And sometimes it can be, hey, this chapter needs to be rewritten. You need to, you know, cut these 20 pages. They don't really help contribute to your main point. And so this is all, you know, a part of the process. And that feedback makes all the difference in terms of producing great writing that contributes to a field. So more revising, more editing, and eventually you get to kind of like the production stage. They lay out the book on the page. You get proofs back that you read through the book again to proofread for typos and whatnot. At some point, you have to build an index. Some publishers may help with that or do it for you, but typically the author is heavily involved in the indexing. So I've done 2 indexes now this year, and they're fairly time consuming and whatnot, but also kind of interesting in their own way. And then the book comes out and you work with the publisher to promote to promote the book. I want to give you a few resources here, and I do have a link to these slides at the end of the presentation, so you'll be able to download these slides if you want to have a record of them, or if you want to visit these links, so you don't have to copy them down right now if you don't want to. But these are some archives and resources that are really amazing in game studies. The first of which is the Learning Games Initiative Research Archive. And this is the one that Judd Regill and Ken McAllister founded, the University of Arizona. I see them and chat with them every year, well, before the pandemic, at least every year, at the Southwest Popular Culture Association conference that's held in Albuquerque, New Mexico every year. And so this is a massive archive that attempts to preserve every arcade game, video game, console, print materials related to video games, magazines, anything you can think of pretty much, they house in this massive archive at the University of Arizona. The even cooler thing about it is that for game studies scholars, this is a research archive, so they will actually ship out pretty much anything except for arcade games, I'm told. But anything else they'll ship out to you for free to be able to play and study those games. And so really cool archive. And there's a similar one you'll see, I think four points down at the University of Texas at Austin. They have a video game archive as well. There's an LGBTQ video game archive that's just a fabulous resource for not only LGBTQ games, but trying to map out the terrain of LGBTQ characters or stereotypes even across as many games as possible. And so that's a very collaborative archive that I turn to quite a bit in my research. A more recent one is the Indigenous Game Developers Resources. And I found out about this one through another contributor to the Skyrim book, Dr. Wendy Sierra. It's basically a site for Indigenous game developers to pool resources and share content and ideas. But they also have a resources page that catalogs as much scholarship, kind of post-colonial scholarship and Indigenous studies scholarship as it relates to video games. And so it's a really great resource in that regard. The last one here was the Retro Mobile Gaming Database at North Carolina State University. This is kind of an interesting one because as I understand it, their database attempts to preserve and catalog all of the mobile games basically before the smartphone, right? And so you have games on, LG chocolates and razors and Blackberries. What happens to all of these games when these devices are no longer in use? And so this database catalogs and preserves copies of these retro mobile games. So just real quickly here, I wanted to mention a couple opportunities for undergraduate students related to game studies, but also outside of game studies as well. The first one, if you're doing anything with pop culture, this just came across my email a week or two ago, is the 2022 Midwest Pop Culture American Culture Association Conference, kind of the Midwest version of the one I go to typically in Albuquerque. And so this conference is very friendly towards undergraduates. They specifically make a point of inviting undergrad and graduate students. This is also going to be an all virtual conference in March. So the call for papers, the abstract, the proposal that you have to send in is due at the kind of the 1st of January, if I recall. And so if you're doing anything in your coursework or on your own related to pop culture or American culture, this would be a great place to present it. The regional conferences are often a very supportive group from what I've experienced. Another opportunity is MIA, the Mideast Honors Association conference. This is namely for undergraduates, and it's going to be hosted in Cleveland this year. And so that's another one you can visit. That's open to all different disciplines. And so if you're doing research in computer science, if you're doing research in the sciences, if you're doing research in the humanities, and you want an outlet to share that, that's a great opportunity to do that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the University of Pennsylvania's call for papers. The link is there. That is typically more geared towards graduate and kind of career academic publications, but I have seen opportunities, conference and publishing opportunities for undergraduates posted there. And so that's a resource that a lot of us use to find places for our work. So a few recommended books. I mentioned Judd and Ken's Gaming Matters book. Shira Chess's book, Play Like a Feminist, is very recent. It was just published, I think, last year. And it has an animated kind of digitized version of a Medusa figure on the front. It's a great book because while it makes contributions to game studies, it's also written for a popular audience. So it's a very accessible book. It's easy to read, interesting to read, and I'd highly recommend it. If you're interested in game studies, another great book would be Franz Meyer's An Introduction to Game Studies. And that's more of a textbook. It's a fairly thin textbook, but very interesting and covers a lot more than what I've had time to share with you today. And so here's the link to the slides. I'm going to try to throw it in the chat here for those of you who have access to the chat. It is case sensitive, so it's just www.mikepiero.org/LCCC lowercase event.pptx, and that'll give you a copy of today's slides. A couple, just real quickly, a couple projects that I have coming up that I'm really excited about. I actually have a meeting tomorrow morning with the editor from Amherst College Press. They recently reached out to me about doing possibly doing a book together. And so I'm working to prepare a book proposal for them titled High Score, A Cultural History of Drugs and Video Games, which I'm only getting started in that research, but happy to talk about during the Q&A session. I'm also taking a stab at working on a novel, which I've never done before, and it could be an absolute failure. But that's never stopped me from working on something new before. So it's tentatively titled Rogue Burnout, and I'm really excited about working on that. My contact information is over there. Always feel free to reach out to me with questions or comments. And thank you again so much for having me. And I understand we have some time for